In 1963, a Rosebud Sioux social worker living in the Bay Area, Belva Cottier, read an article about the Alcatraz Penitentiary. It was closing and the property was to be given to the city. Remembering the promises of the Fort Laramie Treaty, she proposed that if the land was surplus, the Sioux could claim it. She soon organized an occupation and court action to obtain titles for the land. On March 8, 1964, a group of 40 people, including photographers, reporters, and a lawyer, occupied the island for around 4 hours. The protesters offered the federal government around 47 cents per acre, $9.40 for the whole island, or $5.64 for the 12 usable acres, the same rate the government originally offered them for their ancestral lands. The protesters eventually left under the threat that they would be arrested and charged with felonies. The United Council of Bay Area Indian Community initially considered filing an application for Alcatraz. Plans were drawn up to use the building on Alcatraz as a cultural center. More direct action to obtain the space was initially inspired by the loss of the San Francisco Indian Center to a fire on October 10, 1969. Strategies for claiming Alcatraz for use by the local indigenous communities quickly shifted from formal applications to an immediate takeover. On November 9, 1969, a symbolic boat ride around Alcatraz was planned to gain the attention of the local news. 5 boats were organized to take 75 indigenous people over to the island, but they never arrived. The owner of a 3-masted yacht was convinced by occupiers to drive by the island. 4 of the protesters jumped overboard in an attempt to swim to shore and claim the island by right of discovery. The Coast Guard quickly ended their attempts. Lanata Means, dissatisfied, hired a fishing boat to make way to the island once more. 14 ended up staying overnight. The following day, November 10th, Richard Oakes delivered a proclamation to the General Services Administration, after which the groups were removed. The next day, Lanata Means would decide on the date of November 20th to occupy the island once more, because Oakes had said they would not go back out, giving them an element of surprise. This was the beginning of the 19-month-long occupation. November 20th, 1969, 89 Indigenous Americans, including more than 30 women, students, married couples with 6 children, set out to begin an occupation. A successful Coast Guard blockade prevented the majority from reaching Alcatraz, but 14 were able to make it through. The first few occupiers were later joined by many others in the following days and weeks. There were 400 people inhabiting Alcatraz at the height of the occupation. Native women helped run a school, a daycare, a health clinic with doctors and nurses, and a kitchen that cooked for the occupants. Native and non-native people brought food and other necessities to the island via canoe. The dropped-off supplies would then need to be carried up steep ladders. The Coast Guard's blockades made it increasingly more difficult task to complete. Space was rented on Pier 40 to facilitate the transportation of supplies and people to the island. The daughter of Jim Thorpe was among the occupiers and convinced celebrities to visit the island and show their support. She brought national and international attention to the occupation and also helped provide supplies necessary to the occupation to keep it running, including a generator, a water barge, and an ambulance service. The rock band Creedence Clearwater Revival donated $15,000 to buy a boat for reliable transportation to Alcatraz. Lanata Means didn't get as much recognition as she deserved. She was one of the first to arrive and the last to leave Alcatraz. She had written many statements and speeches that explained the purpose of the occupation. Indigenous rights advocate Dean Shavers said that Means was the real leader. To the media and federal government, Means made it clear that the occupiers were demanding and expecting complete indigenous control of Alcatraz for the purpose of building a cultural center that included Native American studies, an indigenous spiritual center, a Native ecology center, and a museum. It would also include full-time indigenous consultants, teachers, librarians, and staff, leading people around the center, telling the different stories of all the tribes. One of the occupiers, John Trudell, started broadcasting daily from the island. Radio Free Alcatraz was an important component to the occupation. It broadcasted 39 different half-hour programs to more than 100,000 listeners. There are physical copies of all 39 broadcasts, 4 of which have been digitally preserved and are available to the public. Trudell spoke in a calm Midwestern voice about the important indigenous issues like the loss of ancestral lands, indigenous spirituality, contaminated water on reservations, infant mortality, and life expectancy rates among indigenous people. He addressed listeners as a plain-spoken, calm mediator. The FBI thought Trudell to be an especially dangerous voice for Native rights. On January 3, 1970, Yvonne Oakes, 13-year-old stepdaughter to Richard Oakes, fell to her death, prompting the Oakes family to leave the occupation, saying they no longer had the heart for it. Some of the occupiers left to return to school, and some of the new occupiers had drug addictions. John Trudell said that the water was still their biggest problem, and how rapidly their number two problem was becoming electricity. The government would often shut off all electricity to the island to make it difficult for the occupants to access water, in hopes they would abandon the island. After Oakes left, leaders were challenged with reorganizing the occupation. Means, being from a family that was constantly active in tribal politics, was quite comfortable briefing reporters. So when Robert Robertson, a Republican working for the National Council on Indian Opportunity, visited the island, Means took the opportunity to negotiate a grant for the Cultural Center, Museum, and Thunderbird University of Alcatraz. Means invited Robertson to a dinner between her and three lawyers to request a $500,000 grant. Robertson refused and would continue to until May 1970, when the government began the transfer of Alcatraz to the Department of the Interior and a national park system. Meanwhile, communications between occupation leaders diminished and opposing views accumulated. Their demands were contradictory, and their inability to see past differences and compromises was detrimental to the occupation. By late May, all of the electrical power and telephone services to the island were cut off by the government. In June, a fire of unknown origin damaged many buildings. Without power, fresh water, and diminishing public support, the number of occupiers had greatly reduced. On June 11, 1971, a group of officers removed the last remaining 15 people from Alcatraz. Though rife with contention and ended by force, the occupation was thought of by many to be a great accomplishment, for raising international attention to the situation of Native peoples in the United States and for inspiring more than 200 different occurrences of civil disobedience among Indigenous Americans. Some 50 Alcatraz occupiers traveled to the East Bay and started another occupation of an abandoned missile installation on June 1971. The Alcatraz occupation influenced the occupation of Catalina Island in 1972 during the Chicano movement. In March 1970, the United Indians of All Tribes, a group based in Seattle, occupied Fort Lawton, insisting on the return of lands that were about to be declared surplus to Indigenous people. Of those involved, one stated that if it had not been for their determined effort on Alcatraz, there would have not been any movement here. We would like to think that Alcatraz lives on in part through Fort Lawton. Most Indigenous activism of the period can be traced to the occupation. The Trail of Broken Treaties, BIA occupation, Wounded Knee incident, and the Longest Walk all can trace their inspiration back to the occupation of Alcatraz. When AIM members seemed the Mayflower on Thanksgiving 1970, Alcatraz was noted as the symbol of a newly awakened desire among Indians for unity and authority in a white world. The occupation also greatly influenced the American government's decision to end the Indian Termination Policy and to pass the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. Alcatraz may have inspired many other movements, but it also showed how gender played a part in Indigenous activism. Mainstream media had an obsession with the stereotype of the male native warrior, so it was only the men that were highlighted as leaders of the movement. Women in the occupation of Alcatraz received little attention for their contributions. As a result, many women would never be as well known, even though in the case of Wounded Knee, of the 350 occupiers, only 100 of them were men. Upon reflection, John Trudell stated that we got lost in our manhood. The Alcatraz occupation led to an annual celebration of Unthanksgiving Day, a day to celebrate the rights, accomplishments, resistance, and history of Indigenous people, where all are welcome to attend a dawn ceremony under permits by the National Park Service. On Indigenous Peoples Day in 2019, there's a symbolic and emotional canoe journey around the island, commemorating the then upcoming 50th anniversary of the occupation.